Welcome to Paulo Theater, Professor Danilo Santos de Miranda, Regional Director of SESC São Paulo, and the publishing house Companhia das Letras. Thank you for your presence. As a tribute to the 25th anniversary of Companhia das Letras, Amós Oz is going to deliver the lecture, Literature and War, Israeli Prospects, completing a number of activities held throughout the year. At the end of the conference, a cocktail will be served on the ground floor, and there will be an autograph session with the author, Amós Oz. He's going to autograph 100 books, one book per person, given you have a password. Before going on with our event, we wish to thank Dr. Carlos Augusto Calil, Local Secretary of Culture. Now we wish to give the floor to Mr. Luis Schwartz, the publisher of Companhia das Letras, the editor of Companhia das Letras.
Boa noite.
I was going to begin with the traditional heartfelt thanks, but looking at this huge auditorium, I won't resist, and I'll make a slight digression. Can you hear me better? Yeah? Okay. I've been with Amós Oz for 3 days. He's been here for 3 days. And during these 3 days, we have fought a constant duel of jokes of Jewish mothers. He has won. But looking at the audience here, I remembered one I told him that reproduces my feeling here 25 years later after having started Companhia das Letras and looking at this audience. The Jewish mother calls the department, the ombudsman of the largest department store in the United States, Macy's, and the ombudsman answers and says, Macy's, complaints department. And she says, "Ui, ui, ui." I think that I only wanted to utter this "ui, ui, ui" and leave. There are many others that think I am their Jewish mother, so they understand this sigh full of pleasure that only Jewish mothers can sigh. Well, I wish to thank Khalil very much. He is an author and the Secretary of Culture. I wish to thank SESC. Danilo Miranda isn't here tonight, but this is where we hold our major celebrations. Here we had the last lecture delivered by José Saramago, the launching of Jorge Amalo Works, Lígia Fagundes Teles, many important events in our history. I wish to begin by thanking a few people who aren't here and who have helped me greatly when the Companhia das Letras started 25 years ago. In the backyard of my grandparents' printing house, my grandfather, my grandmother, Giuseppe Mitzin, my father, who, supported me, who felt so proud of that unexpected success, and who are no longer here. Now, going on with another Jewish mother, joke, I wish to thank my mother, and thanks to her affection, she raised this perfectionist and paranoid being. In addition to giving me a big non-fiction repertoire of jokes, I wish to thank Maria Helena Salles, who has followed the emergence of this idea and who helped me find strength inside of me to deliver Companhia das Indias, das Letras, sorry. I wish to thank my partner, Fernando, and with him, Pedro, João, and Walter. I think Fernando isn't here either. But anyway, I looked for partners, and I found great friends, almost brothers, Sergio, who together with Fernando planned this publishing house before it came into being, and then joined the Companhia das Letras a bit later on. Sergio, in a way, is the opposite. Maybe he sometimes clips my wings, he makes me less bold. I listen to him, I get angry, but the mix is good. He is my companion of all times, and he is greatly responsible for the result you have seen here. Elisa, Maria Emilia, and now Matinas, honoris causa partners, great friends who have been following our course. A very special friend who came from the United States to this event, an example of how, by publishing books, I ended up by making great friends. This person is Maria Campbell, a scout and a friend. I'm very proud of our friendship. I wish to thank all of my staff. I was thinking about it at home, and I think everybody will be called an editor, because at the end of the day, everybody likes books, they read, so we have the delivery publisher, the accounting publisher. I think this will be the next big change at our company. I wish to thank Pedro and Julia. The best things I have produced together with Lilia and Luis Henrique, who's now a father, and the magnificent Zizi and Alice. They teach me fiction, philosophy, and joy. I mean, what else can you expect? Is there anything better? And last but not least, I wish to thank Lily. That's my most important thanks. Without her, nothing would have come true. If something goes right, that's because she added me, both my heart and my body and my soul. Together with Lily, I have this wonderful family from the Moritz family. I wish to talk about the choice of Amós Oz for tonight. When we thought of holding this series of events, we wanted to conclude. We had the party in Paraty. It was a great ball. And then I immediately thought of Amós Oz. I wanted an author who was a great friend, even though we don't see each other very often, but a friend from the heart who could represent all writers with his presence. I called Amós, and he asked me for a week to think, and after a week he accepted. In his person, I pay a tribute to all the authors. The publishing house only exists thanks to you, Amós, and thanks to all writers. This audience is here to show that this is our role. We wish to tell Amós how much we like him. We wish to tell writers how much we enjoy literature. I also wish to tell you a brief episode that happened in Rio, Before this event, we held an event at the Moreira Salles Institute, and before it began, Joanna asked me to bring someone to the room. And then a very simple-looking guy came along, and he said, I came from UN, 800 kilometers from Rio, in the state of Minas Gerais, where I have a bookstore called Oz. And he gave me this picture. He gave Amós Oz this picture. It's a bookstore and a cyber cafe. I think that if Amos hadn't come to talk here, he came to Brazil to see this picture, to show the importance he has for us, Brazilians. I really wish to thank him very much for having accepted this invitation. I think this audience and this picture are the best gift we can give him. I have started to look for something to read one paragraph of one of his books that preferably spoke about friendship, because I spoke about friendship so much. Friendship gives rise to books, and that's why we publish books. I was looking for a text, and then all of a sudden Amos's literary agent sent us a new foreword written by Amós that he had written to celebrate his 40th anniversary of My Michael. I told Lily, you're reading the book. This is the foreword, and then I'll read it. Next, Lily knew that I had asked her that if she found any paragraph in My Michael, anything that she found interesting while I was rereading a few books, Lily called me and said, look, in this foreword you can get inspiration to talk during our celebration night. I started reading the foreword, and I decided that I shouldn't inspire myself in it. I should read it, because that shows what publishers do. We speak through authors. In addition to these thanks, I wish to ask permission to use Amos's word, use authors' words, respecting them, disseminating them. This is the role of publishers. So I'm going to conclude. But you will be in Amós Oz's companies through my voice or my reading. This foreword was written to celebrate the 40th anniversary of this book, his first major success. It's a book where a woman tells how she sees her husband, her life, and her Michael, the Michael that exists in fiction and the imaginary Michael. Amós says in his foreword that will be published in the next edition of My Michael. My novel, My Michael, is written entirely from the point of view of a woman in the first person. I was about 26 years old, and I was certain that I knew everything about women. Today, I would not dare write an entire novel in a female voice. Following its publication, I received many letters from astonished women who asked me, how did you know? But I also received many other letters from women who chided me for not knowing anything. I'll never know who was right. The truth is that I wrote My Michael almost under duress. The character of Hannah so overwhelmed me that I began speaking her idiom and dreaming her dreams at night. And it's not that I copied her from a real person, not at all. She came from wherever she came from, got inside me, and did not let me go. I withstood her for many months, and I did not write a single line. Who am I to write about the love, marriage, and disillusionment of a young woman from Jerusalem who was 10 years my senior? But Hannah would not let go of me. She brought with her into my life her Michael, her parents, his parents, her son and her neighbors, the whole neighborhood, her entire Jerusalem, and also the Arab twins of her dreams that turned into my dreams. I was compelled to begin to write the book in order to get rid of her and get back to my life. My life then was that of a kibbutznik at Huldah, who divided his time between teaching and field crops, very far from Hannah Gonen, from her failing love, and from her dismal Jerusalem. I didn't think I would finish writing this book. I thought I would write a few pages about Hannah, maybe a short story, and so break free of her. I wasn't keen on her or her marital woes, and her secret fantasy life was particularly not to my liking. I began to write the book in 1965, prior to the publication of my first novel, Elsewhere Perhaps. At first, I wrote only on Thursdays. That year, the kibbutz assigned me one work day a week for my literary experiments. But Hannah quickly forced me to write her story every day of the week. Neely and I and our 2 daughters then lived in quarters that consisted of one small room and another room half the size next to the kibbutz offices, opposite the bus stop. I would come home in the afternoon, take a shower, and devote the evening to my family. When the girls and Neely went to sleep, I would sit down and write for 2 or 3 hours into the night. Since I had no study, and since I was unable to write a single line without a lit cigarette between my fingers, and since Neely could not sleep in a smoky room with a light on, I shut myself in the tiny bathroom, which was about the size of an airplane lavatory. I would put down the toilet seat, sit on it, and place on my knees a volume of Van Gogh reproductions we'd received as a wedding present. I'd open my notebook on top of the art book, light a cigarette, and write what Hannah dictated to me until midnight or 1 a.m., when my eyes closed with weariness and sorrow. When I hear about writers who travel to seek inspiration in ambience-laden places with breathtaking landscapes, I recall how I wrote most of my Michael in the toilet. Perhaps it's reflected in the book, most of which, in fact, takes place in a tiny, cramped, murky Jerusalem apartment with a low ceiling. I just said that I wrote everything that Hannah dictated to me, but that's not accurate. The truth is that I fought her with all my might. More than once, even more than twice, I heard myself telling her, "That doesn't fit. It's not in your nature. I'm not going to write that." And she would scold me, "Don't you tell me what's in my nature when what isn't. Just shut up and write." I would insist, "I won't write that for you. I'm very sorry. Go to someone else. Go to a woman. I can't write such a thing. I'm not a woman. I'm not a woman author." She remained adamant. "Write what I tell you and don't interfere." "But I'm not your secretary. You're just a character in my book, not the opposite." We'd fight it out at night, she and I. Sometimes I let her have her way, and sometimes I absolutely refused to give in. To this day, I don't know if the book would have come out better or worse if I had given in to Hannah more or less than I did. When I finished writing my Michael in April 1967, a month before the Six-Day War broke out, and when I finally freed myself from slavery to Hannah, I sat down and read it, and I was overcome with heavy doubts. I had produced a novel where no one got killed and no one was betrayed, a predictable chronicle of a marriage gone sour, of a somewhat hysterical wife, a desolate husband, a nerdy kid, grubby neighbors, and I divided Jerusalem that came out wintry, gloomy, and ominous. Furthermore, 6 weeks later, they were blowing the shofar at the western wall, and the air was full of the Jerusalem the gold, which was the opposite of the Jerusalem of Hannah and Michael. Had I not finished writing finishing the book a month before that war, I surely would have never finished it. I thought to myself, this is a book that will appeal only to a small clutch of sensitive readers willing to make do with a novel that really has no plot, whose heroes are not heroes, and which take place in a city, divided Jerusalem, that no longer exists. With a heavy heart, I delivered the manuscript to an editor at the Amós Oz publishing house. He read it and told me, regretfully, that the book was not marketable and would not appeal to the readers. I also chose this text because it shows how authors look at publishers or see publishers. In fact, he said, it reminded him of a book of poetry, written with sensitivity but not appropriate for the public at large. He offered some ideas for improving the book. For instance, Hannah should cheat on Michael at least once, or Michael could turn out to be a scientific genius and win international fame. Another possibility, they could both leave Jerusalem and open a new chapter in their lives elsewhere, perhaps at a kibbutz. And maybe it would be best to change the book's title from My Michael to The Hannah Diaries. And why such an old-fashioned name? Why, maybe I could call her Noah or Ruthie? But even if I were to refuse to make such changes, the editor said, Amós Oz would deign to publish the novel as it was. He just wanted to give me some food for thought and to suggest how I might put a little life into my drab story. For my part, I was elated by the words written with sensitivity, and I agreed with him about the public at large. He wanted to issue a very small printing, but because of a mishap with another title, My Michael ended up coming out in April 1968, almost a year after I submitted it, as part of the People's Library. To the publisher's surprise, to my own surprise, and to the surprise of a handful of close friends who had read the manuscript, My Michael turned into a bestseller almost overnight, read both by women and men. Nearly 130,000 copies were sold in Israel, and hundreds of thousands of other copies were bought by the readers of the 28 languages into which it was translated, in the 72 editions that were issued throughout the world. Maybe it really is true that some books are universal precisely because they are so provincial and spacious, because precisely they are so minimalist. Maybe. Sometimes I go back and think about Hannah Gaunan and her husband Michael in their gloomy apartment, about their dreary, uneventful lives, and I remember Hannah's voice recounting to me in the toilet at Kibbutz Hulda the misery of her entrapment, her unslackened longing for far lands, bustling cities, vast panoramas. I see Hannah standing at her window, always looking out over the expanses she could not reach, and I tell her to myself, Hannah, now you're everywhere, in Japan and Korea and China and Bulgaria and Finland and Brazil. Are things just a bit better? Have a peaceful journey, I tell her, and then I return to what I'm writing now, so far and not so far from her. Thank you, Amós Oz. Muito obrigado, Luiz. Eu não posso.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, good evening and shalom to all of you. I am here in Brazil for the 25th anniversary of Companhia das Letras. And let me give you a little lesson in Hebrew, short one. The Hebrew word for publisher, mol, is very close to the Hebrew word for midwife, meyaledet. And I think it's just as well. Louis Schwartz said that as a publisher he feels like a Jewish mother. I think perhaps the right metaphor for publishing house is a midwife, helping the baby to be born, helping the baby to breathe, helping the baby to get out of the mother's womb and into life. So I am the Jewish mother, Louise, and you are the midwife. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to talk about war and battlefield in Israeli literature and about some of my own Israeli perspectives. You will be surprised to hear how little there is in Israeli literature about the battlefield. Very, very few Israeli novels actually describe the experience of fighting. And this is not for nothing. The experience of fighting on the battlefield is so different, so remote from any other human experience that I personally find it impossible to render in words. The battlefield is made of smells, of stenches, of terrible odors, and there is not enough words in the language to convey the stenchiness of the battlefield. However, I'll share with you one battlefield experience, only to show you how far the normalcy of our everyday life is from the abnormalcy of the battlefield. On the eve of the Six-Day War of 1967, I was recruited as a junior officer with a tank unit on the Egyptian front. And the actual beginning of the fighting, I was sitting with my men on a hillside, and suddenly mortar shells began to explode in our midst. I looked at the hill opposite, and there were those strangers aiming mortars at us and shooting shells at us. You know what my first instinct was? To call the police. And I'm telling you, this is the last sane thing that happened to me on the battlefield. The rest was insane. So there is very little about the battlefield, but a lot about the traumas of the past. A lot about the complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab conflict. A lot about moral ambiguities. A lot about the shadow of war and the insecurity of existence on the edge of the abyss. Our literature is essentially a literature of immigrants. Almost every one of us Israelis is an immigrant or a child of immigrants or a grandchild of immigrants. There are today, worldwide, about 8 million speakers of Hebrew. This is a lot. When I was a little boy, the overall number of speakers of Hebrew worldwide was hardly a few hundred thousands, all of them in British Palestine. Everyone over the age of 45 spoke other languages: Yiddish, Ladino, Russian, Polish, German, Hungarian, but not Hebrew. So much so that as a child I feared that when I turn 45 I will suddenly start speaking Yiddish. It is a land of immigrants. The majority of the speakers of Hebrew were not born into Hebrew. It's the language of 8 million people, but it's not the mother tongue of most of them. It's a learned language for most of them. And the experience of immigration is a very spatial experience, a very spatial life experience, and it has a strong impact on our literature. No less than the war, no less than the battlefield. You know, immigrant, someone who comes from another country, determined to forget the old country completely, to erase it. But he or she will never be able to forget the old country. It haunts them in dreams, in nightmares, in longings, in memories. And then the immigrant hopes that in the new country, all the hopes will be fulfilled. Very soon he or she learn that not all the hopes will be fulfilled in the new country. And most of the hopes will not be fulfilled in the new country. And that's when the family of immigrants becomes a kind of Cape Kennedy. The child of the family becomes a rocket into which the family pumps vitamins and education and resources and investment and ambitions, hoping that one day this rocket will take the family hopes high to the sky. Moreover, immigrants forever feel insecure. And if they are in the shadow of a daily threat from a hostile neighborhood, from a hostile Arab and Muslim world, the traumas of the past are redoubled. Immigrants always feel that the children are the most important thing in their lives. And this is strongly reflected in our literature. I will digress for a split second for an anecdote. I am a notorious digressor. The shortest and most powerful political speech I ever heard from a politician came some 50 years ago from the mayor of Ramat Gan, of the city of Ramat Gan. His name was Avraham Krenitzi. And it was the tree planting festival in Israel. One day every year we have a tree planting festival. And there was a gathering of all the kindergarten children in the city of Ramat Gan, each child holding a plant, a sapling, in his or her hand. Thousands of little children. And the mayor stands in front of them, also holding a sapling, and he has to make a speech to the little children. It's not easy for a politician to make a speech to little children. What do you say to them? All the promises that I promised you before the elections I didn't fulfill because I had difficulties, but if you re-elect me once again, I will fulfill all my promises. What do you say to little children? So Mr. Krenitzi, from the depth of his heart and in a heavy Russian accent, uttered a one-sentence speech. He said, "Dear children, you are the saplings and we are the manure." This is not a statement about politicians. This is a statement about immigrants, about the feeling of immigrants and their children. My parents, my grandparents, they left Europe in the 1930s. They were forced to leave Europe in the 1930s. But they were really devoted Europeans. It's not a big deal today. Everyone is a European, and those who are not European yet are standing in line to become Europeans. One day Turkey will become Europe, and after that, who knows, perhaps Iraq and Afghanistan will also become Europe. But 80 years ago, the only Europeans in Europe were Jewish people like my family. Everyone else was a Bulgarian patriot or an Irish patriot or a Norwegian patriot or a Polish patriot. My parents regarded themselves as Europeans. They never regarded themselves as Russians or Poles or Lithuanians. They were Europeans. They knew many languages. They were polyglots. They knew the cultures of Europe, many cultures, and they loved the cultures. They knew the respective histories of European countries, and they loved the histories of Europe. They loved the landscape. They loved the small villages with the meadow and the forest and the little stream and the bridge on the stream. And they loved the ancient cities with the cobblestone squares and the cathedrals and the sound of bells in the darkness. They loved everything European. Above all, they loved the music. How they loved the music to the point of tears. Europe never loved them back. For being Europeans, they were labeled cosmopolitans. For being Europeans, they were labeled intellectuals without roots. For being Europeans, they were labeled parasites. And some of you may remember that those pejoratives, cosmopolitans, intellectuals without roots, parasites, they were the shared vocabulary of the Nazis and of the communists. And when they said intellectuals without roots, cosmopolitans, parasites, they meant my parents for loving Europe. In fact, they were brutally kicked out of Europe in the 1930s when anti-Semitism in Europe became violent. And they had to leave. Fortunately for them, if Europe would not have kicked them violently in the 1930s, it would have murdered them in the 1940s. They had nowhere to go. No place in the world wanted the Jews in the 1930s. No place in the world. My grandfather in the city of Vilnius in Lithuania applied for an American visa. He was told he had to wait 17 years. He had no 17 years to wait in Europe of the 1930s. He applied for French citizenship, they turned him down. He applied for British citizenship, they turned him down. He was even mad enough to apply for a German citizenship just a few months before Hitler came to power, and I'm eternally grateful to the Germans for turning him down, or else I would not be here today. So they sadly resolved to travel to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was the only available lifeboat. The policy of Canada, for example, about Jewish immigration in the 1930s was one is too many. Switzerland claimed none is too many. Australia was more sophisticated than that. The Prime Minister of Australia in the 1930s declared that anti-Semitism is a monster, anti-Semitism is abhorrent, anti-Semitism is ugly, and therefore we don't let the Jews in Australia because we don't want to import anti-Semitism. They had to go to Israel, but they always had this love-hate relationship with Europe, this mixture of nostalgia and disappointment. Today I know that such an emotion is called an unrequited love. They didn't share it with me. You don't share with little children your disappointments with a lover who kicked you out. But now I know that they loved Europe and were not loved by it. My father used to joke bitterly. He used to say in Czechoslovakia there are three nationalities. There are Czechs, there are Slovaks, and there are Czechoslovaks, which are ourselves, the Jews. In Yugoslavia there are 9 nationalities, Serbs and Croats and Montenegrins and Slovenians, but there is also a Yugoslav nation which is us, the Jews. And so on. As a child I didn't understand how bitter this joke was. Now I know it was painful and bitter. My father could read 16 languages. He spoke 11, all of them with a heavy Russian accent. He even spoke Arabic with a heavy Russian accent. So much so that when we walked once into an Arabic restaurant in Jerusalem, and my father greeted the proprietors in high-flown Arabic, there was a moment of embarrassment, and then they answered him in a very polite English, not because they didn't understand his Arabic, but because they didn't even realize it was Arabic. However, he could speak 11 languages. My mother could speak 4 or 5. They used to speak between themselves in Russian and in Polish for me not to understand. And 90% of the time they wanted me not to understand what they were talking about, not because they were talking about sex, but because they were talking about catastrophes. They were talking about the Holocaust that just occurred in Europe, and they were talking about the impending Holocaust in Jerusalem once the British leave and the Arabs will come and kill all of us. This was not for the child, so they conversed in Russian and Polish. They read books in German, French and English for culture. They dreamt their dreams in Yiddish. But me, they insisted on teaching only Hebrew. In Jerusalem of the 1940s, my parents didn't want me to know even one European language. They were afraid that if I had a European language, even one, I might be seduced by the deadly charms of Europe. I will go to Europe and catch my death. So for my own safety, only Hebrew. The first non-Hebrew words I learned to pronounce in English, except for yes and no, were the words, British go home, which is what we kids in Jerusalem used to shout at the British patrols as we were throwing stones at them in the original Intifada, the Intifada of the Jews against the British in 1946, 1947, speaking about ironies of history. However, my parents forever dreamt about Europe. They used to say to me that one day, not in their lifetime, but maybe in my lifetime, our Jerusalem will develop and become a real city. I had no idea what they were talking about. To me, Jerusalem was the only real city. Even Tel Aviv was a dream for me. But today I know that when my parents used the words real city, they meant a city with a river in the middle and bridges across the river. It was hard. The immigration was hard. The immigration was hard for everybody, even for the children of the immigrants and even for the grandchildren of the immigrants. And not only the immigrants from Europe. 1 million Israelis came from Arab and Islamic countries. 1 million Israeli Jews. They have the same love-hate relationship about Egypt and Iraq and Morocco and Yemen as my parents had about Europe. The same love-hate relationship. It's difficult to be an immigrant. Let me tell you one anecdote of immigration. And I will tell it in the way of demonstrating that I believe there is no distinction between comedy and tragedy. When we are young, we all think that comedy and tragedy are two different planets. When you reach to be my age, you will realize that comedy and tragedy are no more than two different windows through which we view the same landscape, the backyard of our life. And also there is no distinction between fiction and no fiction. Everything is a tale. Our fantasies is also reality. So the year is 1993. And my grandmother Shlomit, a very European lady, bourgeois, middle class, well-mannered, she knew 3 or 4 languages, she was educated, she was polite, and she was very genteel. And she stands in the streets of Jerusalem, dusky Jerusalem, hot, sweaty Jerusalem, with the arid hilltops or hillsides, and she stands there wearing her silk dress with a fedora hat with a feather. And she cast one terrified glance at the dusky streets of Jerusalem, at the markets, with the noisy, smelly merchandise in the markets, and the terrible smells to her, terrible smells of oriental flavors and oriental food. And she looks at the men in the market, half naked, sun-tanned, muscular, washed in sweat, and speaking and shouting in a guttural language. She looked at all that, and she issued a verdict. The Levant, she said, is full of microbes. And this became her motto for the 25 years of her life in Jerusalem. She was forever fighting the germs. Ask me, I remember going with my grandmother in the streets of Jerusalem. The germs were running away to the other side of the street. They were afraid of her. She was in the habit of boiling everything. She would boil the vegetables. She would boil the fruit. She would boil herself almost 3 times every day by taking 3 hot baths every single day of her life in Jerusalem, summer and winter. When she was over 80 and with a serious heart condition, her doctor said to her, "Dear lady, if you go on taking 3 very hot baths every day, I am not responsible for what might happen." She considered his words. She decided she was more afraid of the germs than she was of the doctor. And she went on taking her hot baths. And indeed, my grandmother died in the bathtub. Tragedy or comedy, I am asking you. In her death certificate, which I haven't seen, it probably says that the cause of death is a heart attack. This is good enough for the police. It is not good enough for a writer. I dig deeper, and I erase the cause of death, heart attack, and I write instead the cause of death, cleanliness. Her cleanliness killed her. But even this is not enough for me. I dig further deeper, and I say that the cause of my grandmother's death is her obsession, her phobia of the Middle East, which made her take 3 very hot baths every day and die of cleanliness of a heart attack in the bathtub. We are not finished. I believe that underneath her phobia of the Middle East, there lurked a secret fascination with the Middle East. Yes, an erotic fascination. Yes, those half-naked men in the market, sun-tanned, sweaty, muscular, guttural. What killed my grandmother was her secret attraction to the Middle East, which made her wear her cleanliness like a chastity belt around her body and die of cleanliness of a heart attack in the bathtub. I'm not finished. If you have patience, I'm going to dig even deeper into this because this is important. What killed my grandmother was her fear of her fascination with the Middle East, her erotic fascination with the Middle East, a fear that made her wear her cleanliness like a chastity belt around her body and die of cleanliness in the bathtub of a heart attack in Jerusalem. One more step. One more, just one more. Ultimately, I believe that what killed my grandmother was the anger. She was angry with herself for being afraid of her own attraction to the Middle East, a fear that made her wear the chastity belt of cleanliness round her body and die of cleanliness in the bathtub. Comedy or tragedy, ladies and gentlemen, fiction or non-fiction, ladies and gentlemen, who cares? It doesn't matter. But this will convey to you some of the experience of immigrants and some of the essence of Israeli literature. That's what we are all about. It's funny and it's awesome and it's shocking. And many people here in Brazil know the experience of immigration because some of you may be immigrants or the children of immigrants or the grandchildren of immigrants. However, let me tell you this about Israel. Countries are born out of geography. They are born out of history. They are born out of politics and demography. Not Israel. Israel was born out of a dream. And everything that is born out of a dream is destined to be a disappointment. The only way to keep a dream perfect and rosy and unspoiled is never to leave it out. This is true of everything. This is true of traveling abroad. This is true of writing a novel. This is true of living out a sexual fantasy. This is true of raising a family. Once it is fulfilled, it's slightly disappointing. Yes, Israel tastes like a slight disappointment. But the disappointment is not in the nature of Israel. It is in the nature of dreams. Israel is a dream come true, and therefore it is disappointing. Now, I just said that Israel was born out of a dream. This is not accurate. Israel was actually born out of a whole range of dreams, a whole panel of dreams, a whole spectrum of dreams. I will tell you about some of the dreams of the founding fathers and mothers of Israel. Some of them dreamed that Israel will become a biblical country, a renewal of the kingdoms, the ancient kingdoms of David and Solomon, a nation of soldiers and priests and peasants and prophets. Still others dreamt that Israel should become a replica of an East European Jewish shtetl. To this day, I confront with non-Israeli Jews who come to Israel for the first time and express to me their disappointment. No bagel, no lox, no Jewish state. Still others were Marxist Zionists. They believed in Stalin. They had a dream, which they never put into words, but in my head as a storyteller, I will reveal their dream to you. They secretly dreamt until 1952 that one day Stalin himself will come for a visit in a kibbutz. And they will give Stalin the grand tour of the kibbutz, the chicken poultry, the cowshed, and then they will drag Stalin to the communal dining hall for a lengthy discussion about Marxism-Leninism, and they will teach Stalin once and for all what Marxism-Leninism really meant, because they knew better. I'm not being ironical, they really knew better than Stalin. And then at the end of the night, so they dreamt, at the end of the night, Stalin will rise to his feet and say to them in juicy Russian, "Bloody Jews, I have to admit you did socialism here better than we did in Russia," and then die of happiness. And next door to those Marxist Zionists, there live the middle class Zionists and the Middle European Zionists, who dreamt of creating in the heart of the Middle East a replica of Austro-Hungary of the Emperor Franz Joseph, with red-tiled roofs and very good manners, and people calling each other Herr Direktor, Frau Doktor, and peace and quiet between 2 and 4 in the afternoon every day. And next door to theirs, but I could go on for the rest of this evening, or maybe write a trilogy one day, which I still threaten to do, about the tremendous variety of the dreams and master plans and visions of the founding fathers and mothers of Israel. Obviously, those dreams could not be fulfilled, partly because it's not in the nature of dreams to be fully fulfilled, and partly because these dreams were conflicting and mutually exclusive. So, what became of all these dreams? Some of them have died and forgotten. Many of them are still alive and struggling with each other under a different banner. Some of them have turned into nightmares. And some of them are the reality of Israel. But the actual reality of Israel is totally different than any of the dreams of the founding fathers and mothers. Let me tell you, there is a huge difference between Israel of the media, I don't know the Brazilian media, but the European media and the American media, the Israel of the CNN and the real Israel. In the Israel of the media, there are 80% religious fanatics or hot-headed zealots of settlers in the West Bank, 19% heartless soldiers in the roadblocks, and 1% of wonderful intellectuals like myself who criticize the government and struggle for peace. This has nothing to do with the reality of Israel. In fact, about 80% of the Israeli Jewish people live on the coastal plain. They don't live in Jerusalem and they don't live in the settlements. They live on the coastal plain. They are not Orthodox. They are middle class, noisy, passionate, pushy, argumentative, talkative, warm-hearted. In short, a very Mediterranean nation. We Israelis belong in a Fellini movie, not in an Ingmar Bergman film. You will figure out from what I just said that I love Israel even at times when I don't like it. In fact, I love Israel even at moments when I can't stand it, and there are such moments for political reasons. But I love it because of the diversity and the argumentativeness. If you promise to take what I'm going to say now with a smile, I will tell you that Israel is not a nation, Israel is not a country, Israel is a fiery collection of arguments. 8 million citizens, 8 million prime ministers, 8 million prophets and messiahs. Everyone with his or her personal formula for instant redemption. Everyone shout at the tops of their voices, no one ever listens. Except for me, I listen sometimes, that's how I make a living. Every line by a bus stop in Israel is likely to catch a spark and turn into a fiery street seminary with total strangers while waiting for the bus, arguing passionately on politics, morality, religion, history, and the real purpose of God. With the participants of such a street seminary, total strangers, while disagreeing on political and metaphysical good and evil, are nevertheless elbowing their way to the top of the line. If you come to Israel as tourists and you have a sleepless night in the hotel, I have a proposition for you. Pick up the telephone, dial any number at all at random, and you get yourself a wonderful argument on the topic of your choice. All of this is reflected intensely in our literature. Israel might be the only country in the world where prime ministers invite writers and poets for a late-night, soul-searching conversation, not in the office, in the private mansion of the prime minister. I have been through this game with 7 or 8 out of our 10 prime ministers since Israel was created. And the prime minister will ask you, where have we gone wrong? Where does the nation go from here? He will admire your answers and ignore them completely. But that's only natural. You can't expect the present generation of Israeli writers and poets and intellectuals to be more successful than the prophets. Even the prophets in their day were not very successful in changing the minds of the rulers or the heart of the people. So, in a strange sense, Israel is a refugee camp, a threatened refugee camp. Palestine is also a refugee camp. The clash between Israelis and Palestinians is a tragic clash between two refugee camps. Actually, it's a clash between two victims of Europe. The Arabs were the victims of Europe through imperialism, colonialism, exploitation and humiliation. The Jews were the victims of Europe through discrimination, persecution, and ultimately mass murder on an unprecedented scale. You would have thought that two victims, especially two victims of the same oppressor, love one another and hug one another and march together to the barricades to fight against their oppressors. Not so. In real life, some of the worst conflicts are precisely the conflicts between two victims of the same past oppressor. Two children of the same violent parent don't love one another. They look at each other and they say, you are exactly like him. No, you are exactly like him. And this is precisely the situation between Jew and Arab in the Middle East. The Arabs are looking at us Israelis and they don't see us as what we really are a bunch of half-hysterical survivors and refugees. No, they see us as an extension of the white, sophisticated, oppressing, colonizing Europe. We look at the Arabs. We don't see them as fellow victims of Europe. We see them as a new incarnation of our past oppressors, Cossacks, pogrom makers, anti-Semites, Nazis, who grew mustaches and wore kafiyas, but they are in the same old anti-Semitic game of cutting Jewish throats for entertainment. Yes, the clash between Israel and Palestine is, in my view, a clash between right and right. And many of the Israeli writers and poets share this opinion, and much of the Israeli literature is about this moral ambiguity. It's a clash between right and right because the Palestinians are in Palestine, they have no other land. The Israeli Jews are in Israel, they have no other land. The Palestinians have nowhere to go. Some of them went as refugees to the neighboring Arab countries, but they were humiliated and oppressed and kept in camps in dehumanizing conditions. They have learned the hard way that they are not Egyptians and not Lebanese and not Syrians, they are Palestinians. The Israeli Jews have no other land. They are all survivors and refugees, like my parents, like my family, kicked out by Europe or kicked out by the Arab and Islamic countries. Now this is the definition of a tragedy, a clash between right and right. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, it's a clash between wrong and wrong. But I believe in the possibility of an historical compromise between Israelis and Palestinians. I believe such a compromise is not only possible, but also feasible. Yes, we'll have to divide a very small country. It's very, very small. We'll have to divide it into two even smaller apartments. We'll have to divide the house into two smaller apartments. I think in English this arrangement is called a semi-detached house. And we'll have to learn to live like neighbors. Now I've got some good news for you. You are all used to hear the bad news from the Middle East. Let me share with you some good news from the Middle East for a change. The majority of the Israeli Jews and the majority of the Palestinian Arabs accept now, not with joy, but they accept now the two-state solution. Israel next door to Palestine. Public opinion surveys in Israel and in Palestine show month after month that about 70% of the population in Israel and in occupied Palestine, 70% heavy-heartedly, unhappily accept the two-state solution. Are they happy about it in Israel and in Palestine? They are not happy about it. Will they be dancing in the streets when the two-state solution is implemented? They will not be dancing in the streets. It's going to hurt like amputation both to the Israelis and to the Palestinians. The Israelis will have to sacrifice the West Bank, which is the historical and biblical cradle of the Jewish people, which is where many of the biblical occurrences took place, which is where the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Israelites lived thousands of years ago. And we will have to renounce the West Bank because it's heavily populated by Palestinians. The Palestinians will have to renounce cities like Haifa and Jaffa and Beersheba, which used to belong to them before 48, and they will have to say goodbye to those people, to those places. This is going to hurt. But this surgery is unavoidable. The Israelis and the Palestinians cannot live together like one happy family because they are not one, because they are not happy, and because they are not even family. They are two unhappy families. They have to divide the house. This is known to everybody except the leaders. And I think the leaders know it in their heart of hearts, but they don't have the courage to do what in their heart of hearts they know has to be done. If I could use a simple metaphor, I would say the following. The patient, Israeli and Palestinian, is reluctantly ready for the surgery, but the doctors are cowards. Ladies and gentlemen, this moral ambiguity has been reflected by our writers and poets for more than 40 years now, since the Six-Day War in 1967, when Israel occupied the West Bank and occupied the Gaza Strip and occupied the Golan Heights and occupied Sinai and occupied West Jerusalem. So we will have to seek a compromise. I know that the word compromise has a very negative connotation in the ears of young idealists. Young idealists tend to think that compromise is dishonest. Compromise is soft. Compromise is lack of integrity. Not in my vocabulary. In my vocabulary, ladies and gentlemen, the word compromise is synonymous to the word life. And where there is life, there are compromises. And the opposite of compromise is not idealism. And the opposite of compromise is not integrity. The opposite of compromise is fanaticism and death. When I say compromise, I don't mean capitulation. I am not in the business of turning the other cheek to an enemy. I have been on the battlefield twice in my life, and if Israel's existence is threatened, I will go to the battlefield a third time and a fourth time. But I will only fight, if necessary, over the existence of Israel and its freedom, not over extra territories, not over holy places, not over resources, not over so-called national interests. I will only fight for life and for freedom. Unlike pacifists in other countries who think that the ultimate evil is war, I maintain that the ultimate evil is aggression. And aggression sometimes must be repelled by force. However, compromise is not capitulation. Compromise is not turning the other cheek. Compromise is an attempt to meet the other somewhere halfway. And believe me, I know one or two things about compromises, having been married to the same woman for more than 50 years now. Now, I said two-state solution, Israel next door to Palestine. I don't like to make predictions and prophecies, but let me tell you this. One day, sooner or later, there will be a Palestinian embassy in Israel and an Israeli embassy in Palestine, and those two embassies will be walking distance from one another, because one of them will be in West Jerusalem, in Jewish West Jerusalem, and the other one in Arab East Jerusalem. This is painful. I was born in Jerusalem. I love Jerusalem. I love all of it. But the city is in fact divided between Jew and Arab, and this will have to be reflected in the compromise solution. People ask me, what about the holy places? What about the disputed holy places? My grandmother Shlomit, the one who died of cleanliness, she had the answer to that. When I was a very little boy, my grandmother Shlomit explained to me in very simple words the difference between Jew and Christian. Not between Jew and Arab, but between Jew and Christian. And she said the following. She said, you see, my boy, the Christians believe that the Messiah have been here once and he will come again one day. We Jews believe that the Messiah has not yet been here and he is still to come. Over this disagreement, said my grandmother, you cannot imagine, my boy, how much anger and hatred and persecution and bloodshed. Why, she said, why can't everybody simply wait and see? If the Messiah comes saying, hello, it's nice to see you again, the Jews will have to apologize to the Christians. If, on the other hand, the Messiah comes saying, how do you do? It's good to meet you, the entire Christian world will have to apologize to the Jews. Until then, said my wise grandmother, live and let live. And this is the answer to the issue of the disputed holy places in Jerusalem. Let there be practical arrangements on the ground so that everybody can pray. Jew, Christian, Muslim, everybody can come and pray. And let us wave no flag over the holy places. The Messiah will come one day and he will tell us, or she will tell us, one day. Ultimately, let me conclude by telling you this. I defined the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a tragedy, a clash between right and right. Tragedies can be resolved in one of two manners. There is the Shakespeare manner of resolving a tragedy, and there is the Chekhov manner of resolving a tragedy. In a tragedy by Shakespeare, in the end, the stage is covered with dead bodies, and maybe justice prevails high above. In the conclusion of a tragedy by Chekhov, everyone is melancholy, unhappy, disappointed, bitter, heartbroken, but alive. Ladies and gentlemen, my friends and I, thank you. My friends and I, many of the Israeli writers and poets, we have been fighting, struggling to find not a happy ending. There can be no happy ending to a clash between right and right. We were struggling to find a Chekhovian, not a Shakespearean conclusion to the Israeli-Palestinian tragedy. Thank you very much for your patience and your tolerance. Thank you very much.